Hey, what's up, guys? So I'm back, and the first video I talked about Thermopylae, sort of the no-brainer, uh, place to kick it off, right? Where how I talked about in the video, kind of where it all started, where we get our conception, our image of the Spartans, and I talked all about that. So now I want to actually run down a baseline of their history, sort of from beginning to end. And I'm going to keep it as brief as possible because truly an in depth rundown from beginning to end would take hours and hours and hours. So, starting kind of, summarily, where Sparta really starts, so we have a period of about 400 years where we talk about Sparta as we kind of know it, what we think of as classical Sparta, but also archaic Sparta. It's not. People will call it classical Sparta, but it extends well back into the archaic period. Sparta technically is a city, a mainland power in Greece, all the way back to the Mycenaean times. What we think of as like the Trojan Wars, contemporary with like the Agamemnon Mycenaeans, would have been contemporaries with Minoan Crete and all that, but that's more of a not like a nominal technicality. So what we're talking about with Sparta is a period of about 400 years, from roughly 750 to 350. Now, technically, what we think of as kind of the cutoff to the end of Sparta is 371, which I'll get to at the end, right at the end here, with their defeat by Epaminondas, the Theban general, at Leuctra, the devastating defeat that crushed them once and for all, or for good. So technically, I mean, we deal with these dates that we put dates to things, and it's not always that, or it's a lot more fluid than that. But anyway, that's kind of where we cut it off. And then where we begin with the Spartans' history as we think about them is round about 750. We'll just call it the 8th century BC with the Messenian Wars. So, long story short, with the Messenian Wars, however they come about, there's a valid argument that the Spartans start them. There's also a valid argument that the Messenians started it. Doesn't really matter. They go to war with Messenia. They end up decades later enslaving the Messenian population. This is what kicks off Sparta as we know it. All right. So Sparta fundamentally becomes who she is because she has this slave population. It's the dark side. It's a topic unto itself, and it's sensitive for a lot of people. I don't want to get into it because it is a topic unto itself. But they are a slave owning is technically the wrong term because the slaves are not owned by individuals, they're owned by the state, if anything. But we'll just make this simple and call them a slave owning population. That's how their world is able to go around. It's how they're able to dedicate their lives to their military affairs. They don't have to get up and, till the fields and such. And this is where it starts, is with the enslavement of the Messenians. That's what enables their society to begin to function the way that it ends up functioning. Now, there's some ambiguity as to exactly when this new Lycurgan law code is resurrected. Now, this is really important to talk about because this is where it starts. So we know the Spartans as we do because they operated by this thing that we call the Lycurgan law code. It comes from a guy called Lycurgus, who history has kind of at times suggested that he's not even a real figure and that he's more of kind of like an embodiment of the state as a whole, and they just gave him a personified name. I don't really think so, but that's a little bit too fine of a point to be examining right now. The point is, Lycurgus is this guy who he's royal blood. We know he's related to I believe the king of Sparta, who yet is still too young to rule. So I think he rules as regent. But anyway, I don't want to get too fine. Lycurgus is a royal blood. He's a Spartan, and he brings this law code to Sparta. Now, I'll give you a little bit of a fine point here. There are kind of two stories about how he brings the code back. It's basically said that he leaves Sparta. There's all these fine details about what's going on in the state at the time. It's intricately tied to the Messenian Wars. The Messenian Wars almost destroyed Sparta. So she went through a period of extreme strife. Messenia almost won the conflict is a big point that I skipped over when talking about the Messenian Wars. Messenia almost won the conflict from what we know. And so the whole history could have almost been reversed. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that crazy? Maybe Messenia became Sparta. But it didn't happen that way. The Spartans were able to pull it out in the end, but they paid a massive price for it, and their state almost collapsed in on itself from all the the strife that they experienced. And so this is where it gets murky, but somewhere in the course of all those decades of conflict and class warfare and all, their state is very much at risk of just kind of imploding. It's just not a good situation in Sparta. Again, there's explanation to it, but I have a lot to talk about, so I'm trying to keep it straightforward and simple. Lycurgus, somewhere in the course of all this civil strife, implements this new law code. Now, what basically we know is that he leaves Sparta on a mission to rectify his state. He leaves to kind of like travel the world and try to find some way to fix what's so kind of foundationally wrong with his people. There are a couple stories. One is that he goes to the Oracle of Delphi and gets divine approval for the law code, which is fascinating because, regardless of how much you ascribe to the veracity of the Oracle of Delphi, if the law code indeed came from what at least they thought of as the word of God, it says a lot about the way the Spartans were living. Now, I'm not getting into any kind of like cosmic or religious examination, but it is a fascinating point to explore if indeed the code, the creed itself that we know so famously, came from heaven itself. That's one story the Spartans tell. The other, well, actually, I think the one that may not be what the Spartans themselves tell. See, what's tricky as always, and I should point this out about Sparta's history, they don't write anything down. So what we hear from them is hearsay. We hear it through Xenophon and Herodotus and Thucydides, and it's just hearsay. They don't write anything down. We hear it all through outside sources. Herodotus is the one who, at least is the source that I'm quoting. He's the one that recounted what I just talked about with Lycurgus and bringing back the law code. And so the Herodotus mentions that there's another version that the Spartans themselves tell. With Herodotus, everything is tricky and murky, so who knows what's exactly true from him, but that's, again, another point entirely. The other version of the story that may be a little bit more ascribed to the Spartans themselves, the one that they tell, is that Lycurgus went to Crete. This is another very famous version of the story. He goes somewhere and he brings this code back. We know that. But the other version is that he goes to Crete, the island of Crete to the south. Now, and apparently they were living by basically this kind of same law code, and he brings it back. So what's interesting about that, and where there's a whole line of kind of thought about this version of the story. What's really interesting is that the Cretans were Dorian, just like the Spartans. So you have there's a few different baseline ethnicities. You have the Dorians. Basically, the Dorians and the Ionians are the two well, and I think the Pelasgians are a third. I'm not the ethnicity expert, but there's a few different basic racial or ethnic groups within Greece. And they come to just be known as what we call the Hellenes, aka Greeks. So they're not all of the exact same bloodline, if you will. The Dorians were supposed to be a people who came somewhere from the north. I think the prevailing theory now is that they came somewhere from the steppe, where mostly all these people migrated into Europe originally. But they definitely came from the north. They were not native to Greece, we'll put it that way. And so they had a little bit more of the dominant kind of conqueror warrior DNA. It's the way we think of the Spartans, right? As being kind of hard, stereotypical, but the Cretans were the same way. And so there seems to be a shared bloodline or shared kinship between the two way back. It's very similar to in the Persian Wars when Athens sends aid to their Ionian brothers across the sea to aid against the Persians because they shared that common Ionian bloodline. So this is a common thing to Greeks. The Argives were Dorians, but the Spartans were mad enemies with the Argives. So it's interesting. The Corinthians were Dorians, but they were close allies with them. Most everybody in the Peloponnesus was Dorian. So I'm getting a little bit off track, but the Cretans were Dorian. So it's not to go into an examination of each version of the story, but each one has its own interesting talking points and viable talking points. One way or another, Lycurgus brings this code back, and this is where it all starts. I really could do a video just talking about Lycurgus and the law code, but that's where it starts. And that's going to happen somewhere, just depends on where exactly you pin it, and it's like a detective's examination. It's going to happen somewhere in the 8th century BC. So we're talking 700 something. 700 something. He's supposed to be the uncle, I believe, of, I think, the king Karolaus, who was too young to rule at the time. And so if you can pin the dates and see exactly when these guys were living, it's tough business. But because you're dealing with like, you can get the broad range of time nailed down, but getting it to like the exact year is what's tougher. Anyway, I'm giving y'all a little more info when I said I wouldn't. So that's where we get our kind of beginning of Sparta. And so you just get this whole law code that this is where we know all the famous things about Spartans, that like nobody was allowed to be out of shape, the common messes, of course the agoge, the peers being, well, peers literally the where we get the all the Spartan citizens being peers or equals. Everybody, they transformed their society from one of, basically it was a tiered society, kind of like most, right? So you had some, you kind of had the wealthy, like 1%, and everybody else down here was kind of struggling. And basically what you get out of the Lycurgan Code is a society of equals. So everybody gets in the, and that goes back to the Messenian Wars, right? So they conquered all this land, so they were able to distribute these land plots equally to the homoioi, what in Greek, what literally translates to like similars or peers, what we call equals. Equals is peers, similars, equals. They go by different names, but the idea behind the homoioi is that they're all the same. And so there is no wealth distinction, no class distinction in Sparta, and that fundamentally, I can't stress enough, that fundamentally is what marks Sparta as Sparta. It's what marks them out amongst like all of history. They're like, some people call them a Marxist state, which is maybe like, basically, yeah, they're a communist state. To call them Marxist, like, I don't know enough about Karl Marx and his ideology and the semantics of that term to really label them necessarily as Marxist. But yeah, the idea is that they're communists. They equally share the wealth, and everybody performs the exact same function, essentially, barring like weird technicalities. It's just a society of equals, and that's what marks them out. It's just fundamentally what marks their society is different. And so after you get the implementation, maybe I should do a video just talking about the Lycurgan Code itself, because it's everything they are. But you get the implementation of that, and for the next honestly, for the next 200 years, we don't hear a lot about them, and it's really interesting. From 750-ish to 550. About 550 is the next place where we really hear something about them. There may be a couple snippets in history, and there's some hearsay and some questionable sources, but there's basically a period of 200 years where it seems like, I'm not going to call them fat and happy. That would not be an apt way to describe them at all, based on the way they lived, but they seem to be without conflict, mostly. You would have to, and you really have, with them, there's a lot of inference that has to take place. You have to really dig and see what's going on in their society. Even when we have good, valid sources surrounding them, you have to really dig, because again, they don't write anything themselves, and that's just so important to talk about. It all comes from the outside, so ultimately, it's just, a lot of it can be guesswork, and it's tricky. So, bottom line is, we don't hear much about them at all from the period of 750-ish to 550. And what happens in 550 is this thing called the Battle of the Fetters. It's a battle that happens with Tegea. Now, I actually just did a recent post on the Instagram account about it, albeit kind of short, because I have to keep everything short on IG. But basically what happens at the Battle of Fetters is, and I'll tell you why it's called the Battle of the Fetters, the Spartans seem to get a big head, and they think they're going to go conquer some more territory, right? So they conquered Messenia 200 years ago. Now they think they're going to go conquer Tegea, the city of Tegea, which is in Arcadia. Arcadia is like Laconia and Messenia is another region in the central Peloponnesus. So they don't necessarily go for the whole of Arcadia, but they go for Tegea, which is a pretty powerful city itself. And it goes on that the Spartans end up developing a pretty great admiration for the Tegeans. They go on to be some of their greatest allies, and I'll kind of, a lot of it comes from this. So they decide they're going to go try to conquer Tegea and get them some more land. Again, it seems like they get a big head, because for 200 years, they seem to be just kind of living in peace, kind of in this utopic world. Nothing's really going on, and then they decide to go conquer some land. So There's not a lot mentioned about the Battle of the Fetters. Herodotus tells us that it happens, and he does make some implication that they had been sort of that they had become sort of stir crazy almost, that they almost like needed something to do, which, making war sounds like a bad way to occupy your monotony, or to, reverse your monotony. But it seems like there's an implication that they had almost gotten stir crazy from just like having too much peace for too long, almost like the Pax Romana sort of. No, I don't know if that's a good I don't know if that's a good example. I'm not talking about Rome. I don't know as much about Rome. But it seems like they get a little stir crazy or something. Bottom line is they go to Tegea, they try to conquer it, and they get their ass whooped. Well, they lose at least. I mean, yeah, you said they get their ass whooped. So it's called the Battle of the Fetters because a fetter is like a chain, right? So they brought these chains or these fetters to shackle the Tegeans in. Like, they had gotten so cocky apparently that they just assumed they were going to win before they won, and that is, I have to do a video on this battle itself, because the examination behind the Spartan mindset and what happened as a result of this battle, and oh boy, it's a big entailment because it's very contrary to what the Spartans were. It's super duper contrary. This is not how they lived. This is not how they acted. It's very contrary, but it did happen, and we know it happened, and so it's a very interesting examination. The point is that they lose, and we have no figures on how many men they lost or anything. It doesn't seem that there was any risk of them in turn being conquered by Tegea. I wouldn't call it a skirmish, but it was maybe a smaller scale battle. Sorry, I got off track. It's called the Battle of the Fetters because the Tegeans chained them in the same fetters, the same shackles that they had brought to chain the Tegeans. So it's a story of irony, and personally, I think the Spartans learned a lot of humility from the defeat. That's sort of an inference, but it's a long discussion. Again, I'll have to do a video on the Battle of the Fetters. But this is a big instance in their history because what happens as a result of it is the formation of the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesian League goes on to be something of like a loose, I don't know if we'd call it a confederacy. It's more like a loose alliance between the Spartans and basically all of the city-states in the Peloponnesus, and that even later on goes on to encompass some of the city-states in central Greece. At times Boeotia, which includes Thebes, and I think Thespia at one point was part of the league. But it's basically like a Spartan-led league, and the agreement of the league was that I don't know if you'd call them subordinates necessarily, but that those in alliance with Sparta would follow Sparta wheresoever she led, the Spartans agreed to protect their interests. The Spartans agreed to protect all the interests of their allies as long as they in return would follow wheresoever she led. So like in the instance of the Peloponnesian Wars, in the eyes of the Spartans called the Athenian Wars that we get, but that history knows as the Peloponnesian Wars, that we get in the late 5th century BC, which I'll get to sometime here. That's where the Peloponnesian League, for instance, comes in to be very important because they needed those allies. Sparta alone never could have won the Peloponnesian War. No way. So bottom line, the Peloponnesian League ends up being very important, and for a second reason. It ensured basically a mutual peace between the states in the Peloponnesus, because without it, you have the very real potential, just like we see with the Battle of the Fetters, the very real potential for these states to be constantly warring, Sparta and anybody else, and then anybody else and anybody else within the Peloponnese. So it was a great, basically, agreement for everybody involved that they were just kind of like, you know what, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. You mind your own business, I'll mind mine. And that's mostly what happened from then on out. Mostly, I mean, there's technicalities and exceptions. There is one big exception to the league, and that was in Argos. Argos was the eternal, most bitter enemy of Sparta, and they go to war. Actually, funny enough, that's actually maybe the next big instance that I should talk about. They go to war about 5 years later. It's called the Battle of the Champions, which then results actually in a second bigger scale battle. There's a land dispute over the hinterland of what's called Thyrea. and it sits like right between Argolis, or the Argolid, the city-state of Argos, and Laconia. So they were always kind of battling over this region. So they once and for all decided to settle the dispute. And they sent 300, funny, isn't it? They sent 300, well, it's not funny, it's the elite guards, numbered 300. They sent their elite 300 troops from each side to battle and square it off once and for all. It's a super interesting story. It almost seems to have like the fantastic written all over it. Basically, not to say that there's any untruth to it, but you just have to look at it. And kind of come to your own conclusions. It's really fascinating. The 300 on each side square off from Argos and Sparta, and at the end of the battle, at the end of the day or whatever, there are 2 Argives left and 1 Spartan. And the Argives claim victory on the basis that there are more of them. There's 2 and there's only 1 Spartan. So the story goes, the Argives abandon the battlefield, but the 1 Spartan, Othryades, he stays. And he claims victory on the basis that he stayed. The Argives fled the battlefield, and so one of the hallmarks of a Greek victory was you stripped the dead bodies of your enemy and set up a trophy. So with a breastplate and helmet and all, you basically made you would take like a tree trunk or something and make like a makeshift human body or whatever and set the armor on it. It's called a trophy. And so he set one of those up and said, "No, I maintained my ground. You guys lost. I won." So the entire armies of the 2 sides were nearby. They had agreed when they arrived actually to make this Battle of the Champions happen, and they said, okay, we'll fall back, and our main forces will fall back and let this be decided between the 300 of each side. Well, when they come back the next day to see what happened, there's this monster dispute, right? Monster dispute. And this is when the full-scale battle ensues, because neither side can agree on who won. Both sides have their argument. Well, we had more men. Well, I stayed my ground. Well, guess what? They meet in full clash, and then the Spartans whoop that ass. The Spartans, actually, I shouldn't say whoop that ass, because we are told that the Spartans do sustain a decent amount of casualties, but it is a decisive, no question about it, it is a decisive Spartan victory where way, way more Argives are lost than Spartans. And so it's decisive. It's the battle. It's basically the battle of the generation for Sparta, and it once and for all does settle that dispute over Thyrea. So that there's not necessarily too much like repercussion to that battle. It's just a decisive Spartan victory, but it is a big moment in their history, and it's one that's really remembered. I hope I'm not like skipping over anything with that. Later on, like 50 years later, there's going to be a few things that happen in between. The Spartans and Argives meet again at Sepaea. And I'll try to go over this one quickly because I can't hit like every single instance in the course of Sparta's history. But they meet almost 50 years to the, like 50, I can't do the math, it's 53 or something like that. But 2 generations later, they meet again at Sepaea, which is very near Thyrea, really. It's in the Argolid, so it's very near Argos. It's probably a few miles or so from Argos. The Spartans march. And there is a lot of interesting kind of backstory or like insight to what's behind Sepaea. That's definitely got to be a video unto itself. I personally think that Cleomenes was the king of Sparta, or one of the kings of Sparta at the time. And I personally think that he was paving the way for a Persian invasion because he knew how inimical Argos was to Sparta. So he basically knew that Persia was coming. They were coming. It was just a matter of a question of when. So he knew that they couldn't fight the Persians and the Argives at the same time, that if the Persians came, which they would, and we know history told us they did come, he knew, Cleomenes is a fascinating character. I'm definitely doing a video on him. He knew that if the Persians came, the Argives would side with them, and being in their backyard, they would just never win. It would be impossible. So basically, it's my conjecture, but I think it's a very safe one, that he marches on the Argives to take the initiative and eliminate that threat for what he knows is coming later in the Persians. That he can't fight both at the same time. So anyway, they march to Sepaea, and basically what happens is that the 2 sides stand off for a while. Neither will make the first move. And this is where I said Cleomenes is like, he's like a mad genius, but he's got some parts to his character that are we'll just call him questionable. He is a, if you really examine him, he is one of the most fascinating characters in the history of Sparta. He is an evil genius. He's a madman, but he's a brilliant madman, and he's a very contrary figure. He gets a very principled place in my book. So fictionally, it'll be interesting for you guys to see how I portray him. But basically, what happens at Sapea is the two sides are standing off from one another. Neither will make the first move. Cleomenes gets a piece of intelligence that gives him some insight into what's going on. And in the very early morning, probably like right as the sun breaks, he ambushes the Argives, like in their beds. They're like not even, they probably literally, as they saw the Spartans streaming across the field, had to try to strap their armor on to get ready. And he just bulldozes the camp. How it happens is, again, I'll do a video on Sapea, but this is the second time that the Argives and Spartans meet, and this is a monstrously important battle, again, because it paves the way for them to be able to fight the Persians when the Persians come. The Argives inevitably would have been a thorn, maybe even a lethal thorn in their side, in the Spartan side, had they still been, because the Argives were a monster, a very powerful, probably the second most powerful people in the entire Peloponnesus, arguably even more than Corinth, more than Tegea. They were a super threat to the Spartans. And make no bones about it, they were a very well trained, again, one of those Dorian peoples, very warlike. They were very capable of standing with the Spartans toe to toe. The Battle of the Champions, where 1 and 2 respectively were remaining, shows that they were capable of holding their own. As much as we talk about the Spartans being the best soldiers, and granted they were, the Argives were great themselves. So you can't sell them short, and they're a monster threat. So I'll try to do a video on Sapea, but this is a big point for Sparta, because she is able to eliminate that threat and focus solely on the Persians. The Persians come 4 years later. That's to Marathon. Technically, the invasion where the Spartans are involved is 14 years later at Thermopylae, of course, and Plataea and all that. And to jump on down, that's actually the next place we go to, is the Persian Wars. And those are so famous, I may not have to talk as much about them. I've done Thermopylae, so luckily I can skip over that because I did the video on that. I may do a second video on Thermopylae specifically to get a little bit more historical and specific, because I had some personal insights into it and such in the video that I did. But that's Thermopylae, right? So 480 BC. And we know what happens there. So after Thermopylae, the Athenians are principally involved and defeat the Persians on sea at Salamis. And then after that, the following spring is when the Spartans lead the victory at Plataea. That's basically the crushing defeat. And then there's like one more at Mycale, that's in modern day Turkey, for my Greeks out there, Anatolia, I know. So there's a couple final battles in the Persian Wars, but the Persian Wars are the next great episode, which are just too big a ball of wax for me to talk about right now. We all probably know enough about the Persian Wars and kind of essentially what happened. And again, Thermopylae, as far as the Spartans are concerned, Thermopylae is one of the biggest parts of the Persian Wars. So I don't think spend too much time talking about that, but that's where we really get our image of the Spartans. So guys, go back and check that video out too. Plataea is a monster battle. Just suffice it to say it's a crushing Spartan victory. They just absolutely annihilate the Persians. Whether or not we believe Herodotus' figures, Herodotus tells us that 300,000 Persians came to the battlefield that day, and that 3,000, I think, were left alive, I think is what he says. Either 3,000 were left alive or escaped or something, but like he literally said, like, it may be a little exaggerated, but they absolutely annihilate the Persians. And so that basically eliminates the Persian threat. The next great, after the Persian Wars, there's like 15 years of peace. And then there is a momentous turn that happens in the Spartans' history, and that's the slave revolt of 465. Again, it's going to be an examination unto itself, but there is a monster earthquake that hits Sparta. Super fascinating background kind of behind maybe what precipitated it, even from like Yeah, I'll just leave that alone. But there's a monster earthquake that hit Sparta. I think on the Richter scale, it's been discovered that it was a 7.2, which I think is, I'm not like any kind of, what do you call it, volcanologist, um, but it's a big earthquake, and we don't know how many were killed. I think there's a figure somewhere of 20,000. It's a tough one to wrestle with. It's possible. One of the things in earthquakes that really kills people is the falling structures and stuff. So, like in our world with tall buildings, that's a big deal. For them, that wouldn't have been as much of a thing, but I don't know. Like a 7.2, you would think there's going to be fatalities, and it's just it's there. You know, you can conjecture all over the board, but what happens? What really matters? Because again, that can be a video into itself as well. But the great fallout of the earthquake is the slave revolt. The slaves, the helots, I don't think it's the entire population, but it doesn't matter. The bottom line is the Helot population takes advantage of the situation, of the chaos in Sparta, and they revolt. Like, right, like put two and two together. Like, it's not shocking. Like, the Spartans are in absolute disarray, just trying to see if everybody's alive. And so the Helots revolt. And again, we're not given statistics on like what percentage of the Helot population revolts. It can't be the whole thing because Sparta continues to exist as a civilization and thrives after this. But we do know that there was at least a portion of them that revolted, and they hold themselves up in their ancient city of Ithome in Messenia. They went back to Messenia. Spartans can't get them out. They suck at siege warfare. So basically what happens in the end is the Helots go free. It takes like 7, 8, almost 10 years for the rebellion to not be put down, but to be open, to end. And that sets off, in the course of that revolt, the Spartans get very hostile with the Athenians. They've always been hostile with them, but there's a certain turn of events where they call the Athenians in to help with siege warfare to try to get the Messenians out. And it's a weird kind of turn of events. What happens? They bring the Athenians in and then they immediately dismiss them. And so there's a lot of thought that they were afraid of the ultra democratic ranks among the Athenians sowing. I can't think of the word, sowing, further rebellion amongst the slaves' ranks. I can't think of the word I'm looking for. But they were very worried about the ultra-democratic Athenians possibly being, or that possibly might be the reason that they were very worried about their presence amongst the Spartans and potentially influencing the rest of the Helot population. Sparta and Athens never got along. They ideologically, and this is even before the Peloponnesian Wars, they were never ideologically similar. They were always at some kind of odds, and they had had some battles in the past and stuff. So it very much insults the Athenians when they get dismissed, and it just basically is the very first prelude to what we know as the Peloponnesian Wars, which don't officially begin for another almost, 3 decades at this point, but it's kind of the first seed that is sown. And actually, it is at the very end of the slave revolt that the Spartans and Athenians actually do go to war. There's like almost immediately after the slaves in Ithome get released, there's the Battle of Tanagra, which it's close to Athens. It's up in Boeotia, which is it's close to Athens in central Greece, and it's a big battle. I forget the numbers exactly, but there's I think 14,000 total on the Athenian side, and I think 11,000 on the Spartan side. It's a big battle, and the Spartans do win. It's decisive in the sense that there's no confusion about who won, but it's not decisive in that it didn't lead to anything. So it's a Spartan victory, but nothing really comes of it. And then there's a peace declared, and that's in 457. So that's almost 10 years, 457 BC, almost 10 years after the beginning of the slave revolt. And there is a peace declared after it, but it's a very shaky peace. What happens next is that the Athenians basically, they've been empire building since the end of the Persian Wars, but they've been doing it very subtly. And they continue to do that. And the Spartans are freaked out. They basically think that they're going to be the next in line. And you know what, guys? We're going to go on the video too, because I think my camera is going to cut me off here. So let's wrap this up with the next thing I'll talk about will be the war between Sparta and Athens. So right now we just finished with Tanagra, and there's basically a piece of 20-25 years between Tanagra and the beginning of the war between Sparta and Athens. So I'm pretty sure my camera's going to cut me off. So we'll pick back up there. Okay, peace.